Greetings and salutations, everyone. I'm coming back here. This is for another session of History of the Bible. Today, I believe this might be the seventh or eighth session. I don't know. I don't keep track of these things. You can always go back, try to find them. But I'm doing these sessions on History of the Bible, Bible translations, asking four major questions. How was the Bible formed, both the New and Old Testaments? How is the Bible inspired? Why are there so many translations, and what goes into the making of a translation? And how to read the Bible and study the Bible. So, as we make our way through, we'll eventually answer all of those questions. And today, I am bringing you a fun exercise in looking at how translators have to wrestle with texts and translate different things according to either bias or politics or different ideas. And the perfect text to do that with is with 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Specifically, you can see it there, verse 33, which includes 33a and 33b, 34 all the way to 35. Now, this is set within a larger argument within 1 Corinthians in which Paul is talking about orderly worship, specifically with prophecy and tongues and interpretation of tongues. So what happens is he talks about a big thing about having orderly worship and how some people within the churches were upsetting the order of the worship and therefore killing the witness of the church because of confusion over tongues, their appropriateness in worship or the setting in worship, interpretation of tongues tied to prophecy. Now, interestingly, 1 Corinthians deals with a lot of issues that has to do with the early church as the church, are wrestling how to be Christians in a pagan world in a way in which people were coming to Christ, and because of that, were experiencing their gifts and contributing their gifts to the church. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul talks about men and women praying and prophesying in church. Now, prophesying is preaching, okay? You can try to contemporize it and make it something it's not. It's not. Prophesying is basically preaching. And so both men and women were praying and prophesying or preaching in church. And it was a little disorderly, so he recommends that men have to do it a certain way. And when women pray and prophesy in the church, that they should keep their heads covered. So when we get to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34 specifically, where it says women should remain silent in the churches, that has led to a lot of confusion because it seems to contradict what Paul assumes about the role of women in leadership and in churches throughout the rest of 1 Corinthians, specifically tied to 1 Corinthians 11, as well as the rest of this argument about tongues, because in another place, in other places when it talks about tongues, he also tells men to be quiet in terms of not speaking in tongues when there is no interpretation of tongues. However, because the politics of interpretation and the fact that men have kind of ruled the roost in church life, this text has been a point of abuse, of misuse, and of confusion. So what we're going to do as a fun exercise is look at the politics of translation when it comes to this text. I have originals. Ignore that. That's because I did a handout of this, so I wanted to make sure I knew what the originals were. I have today four different texts that we're going to look at. 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 35. The first is the NIV, the original 1984 whatever edition. It's not the new one. The new one I'll comment about, but it's not the new one. The King James Version. Okay. Then I have the New Revised Standard Version, but specifically the New Oxford Annotated Bible. And then I have a copy of the 1924-ish, 1928, I'm not sure what year, of the Helen Montgomery translation of the New Testament. She's the only sole woman, or one of the few sole women, to have translated the Bible into English. She also served as the president of the American Baptist Convention in the 1920s, and was quite ahead of her time. What we're going to look at when it comes to politics of translation is try to help you see how translators need to make decisions about certain things, and how sometimes bias can make its way into the translations. So let's look at this NIV first. All right, I want you to notice verse 33, okay? This is paragraph form, okay? So it means it's in paragraph form. And look what it does. This talks about prophets speaking. So let's read it from the top. 2 or 3, this is verse 29. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. For you can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirits of prophets are subject to the control of prophets. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Stop. Now, what this translation does is bring the next part of the sentence down and starts a new paragraph. Sorry, I have it a little off to the side. As in all of the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. Now, the catch here is this part right here in the NIV, okay? Because what it does is it sets apart the first part of verse 33 with the second part of verse 33. Now, if they were to keep verse 33 intact, and the integrity of verse 33, it would read this way. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the saints. Now, what that means is that if they were to keep the integrity of that sentence, that God is a God of peace in all congregations. But by moving it down to the next paragraph and saying, as in all the congregations of the saints, comma, women should remain silent, it implies that women should remain silent. Where? In all the congregations of the saints. Which obviously is contradictory to a lot of Paul's own writing, because we know that women would have spoken within church. But that's what it implies by splitting up that sentence. Now, one of the things that you need to know is original Greek does not have punctuation, and the original Greek manuscripts only had capital letters. So somewhere along the way, people had to decide where to put the verses, the verse numbers, the chapter numbers, the punctuation. And when you make a decision about punctuation, such as this, you can change the meaning of what is said. Is it that God is a God of peace in all the congregations? Or is it that women should remain silent in all the congregations? Well, the NIV version puts it that way. Now I want to compare it to the King James Version. Okay, many of you are King James Version fans. Well, this is a place where you might want to go. Now, unlike the previous translation, this is what we call verse by verse, not paragraph form. So each verse is set alone. So in this case, look what it does in verse 33. For God is not the author of confusion, comma, but of peace, comma, as in all churches of the saints, period. Then it starts a new sentence. We know this because there's a period and a capital letter. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. So in this respect, the King James Version maintains the integrity of verse 33, not implying that women should keep silent in all the churches. It's hard enough that Paul says in one place in 1 Corinthians 11 that women can pray and prophesy in the church, and then here has women be silent. By the way, I heard a lot of Christians use this to justify denying women leadership roles in the church. At the same time, they have women talk in church. So, and they don't force their women to wear like headdresses and things, which earlier 1 Corinthians states that women should keep their heads covered in worship. So there's a lot of other what I call gerrymandering of the Bible when it comes to the politics translation. So that's how the King James treats it. Now, I mentioned that this is the old NIV. If you go to the new NIV, they have changed this. In the new NIV, 33A is coupled with 33B, and they shifted the newer 2011 NIV, as far as I know, from what somebody told me. I haven't looked because I don't have a copy. to maintain the integrity of verse 33. Somebody can check that out and comment. All right. Next translation is going to be the New Revised Standard Version. Now look what they do here. In keeping in the spirit of the Revised Version and other versions, they break up verse 33 with B.A. with 33b. But look what they do. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, period. As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent in the churches, so on and so forth. And look, they put parentheses within 33b through 36. Okay? They also maintain the idea that it's shameful for women to speak. I think that's an important key contextual, interpretive lens that we need, but I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Now, notice two things here. In the NRSV, it gives you a note, B. And in B, it says, other ancient manuscripts put verses 34 and 33, 35 after verse 40. All right? But because this is well, first of all, it puts parentheses around this. Somehow demarcating it or communicating that it's an aside of Paul's, and if you're reading and you see something in parentheses, you really don't pay attention much to things in parentheses. You kind of think, well, that's just an aside and just a random thought. And so in some way, by putting a parentheses, I don't want to say this was their intent, but in many ways it undermines the integrity of that sentence being a part of Paul's wider argument regarding tongues. The fact that they also have a footnote that says that this verse is found elsewhere in authorities also undermines the integrity of the placement of Paul's words within this section. For as egalitarian as I am in leadership and in church polity, I have a problem with that. I think that Paul meant it to be there, and it belongs there. And when we look at it closer in a few minutes, we're going to see why, what else is at work in this text. But because this is the New Oxford Annotated Bible, I want to show you how the Study Bible itself is shaping how readers read that verse. So if you go down to the footnotes, okay, go down the footnotes, okay. So here's the footnote. Let me see if I can get the whole thing. Verse 33b through 36, it says, many scholars regard this passage as a later non-Pauline addition because it disrupts the flow of the argument from 33a to 37. It contradicts the assumption of 11.5 that women will pray and prophesy in the assembly. It resembles the viewpoint of the Deutero-Pauline letters, and it exhibits non-Pauline sentiments. That's certainly a biased interpretation. It is one that many scholars, I say many, mainline scholars hold. For again, as far as I lean in the egalitarian thing, I think that is a leap, and I don't think it is a non-Pauline addition. I had one of the most progressive New Testament scholars as a professor, and he would always say that if it's in the Bible, we need to keep it there as long as it matches up to the a good source manuscript. And I think for the commentator to kind of include that as a way of dismissing it, just I think doesn't do justice to the text. So, I think that's very biased. Again, this is the point of this video, is the politics of translation. Now, last one I'm going to show you is Helen Montgomery's take on this. And I really love this take. I think it's creative, although a stretch. We got to read from the top here, but I'm going to read you from the top. This is verse 32, and then read through, and I'm going to show you a few things. Okay. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. This custom prevails in all the churches of the saints. So she keeps the integrity of 33a and b together, okay? So that's how she handles it. And again, that's much in line with the King James Version, which she would have used regularly as a person in the 1920s. But then you come to 34, and look what she does. She puts quotes around this sentence. In your congregation, you write, that's in brackets, because it's obviously it's imposed upon the text, not in the original Greek. In your congregation, you write, as in all the churches of the saints, let the women keep silence in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. On the contrary, let them be subordinate, as also says the law. And if they want to learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church. End quote. What? Was it from you that the word of God went forth, or to you only did it come? If anyone thinks himself a prophet or spiritual, let him recognize that what I am now writing you is a command of the Lord. But if anyone disregard it, he will be disregarded. What's interesting is that Helen Montgomery takes the context of the writing, acknowledges that the flow of 34 and 35 seem to be disjointed from 36, just as the New Oxford Annotated Bible says it is, as a disjointed added text. But what she does is she assumes that if Paul is confronting the Corinthians' argument that some people have a valid, legitimate word of God and others don't, she puts it in quotes. She puts it, verse 34 and 35 in quotes, as if that is their argument to Paul rather than Paul's argument to them. I think, one, this is really creative. I'm not sure if I would take this to the bank. I wouldn't preach this way because I think it's a stretch. And I admire Helen Montgomery for trying to bring together a seemingly disjointed, very difficult text to interpret. But something she does very interesting is she puts in 33, this custom prevails in all the churches of the saints, and in verse 34, as in all the churches of the saints, she repeats this line twice rather than just leaving it at 33 and letting that go. She brings it down a second time, as in all the churches of the saints, let the women keep silence in the churches, which I think is a little disingenuous because obviously the Greek doesn't repeat it. It's a part of 33. The King James Version acknowledges that. The new 2011 NIV acknowledges that. And I think that's the best way to read verse 33. So it's interesting. I bring it out because obviously this is a woman, and I think that it's creative, but not necessarily authoritative as a way to preach it. If I were writing a research paper, I would include it as an avenue for seeking how people have dealt with this text, but obviously by not I wouldn't preach it as if it was written from the congregation. So what is going on with 1 Corinthians 14? I mean, what's really happening? Well, let me show you a few things that I have always questioned, okay? This is what's happening. Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate as the law says. Now let me ask you folks out there in video land, who is the one person in the Bible who would argue that Christians have to follow the law? Okay, who is the one person who says that when Christ came, we are neither Greek nor Jew, male nor female, slave nor free? That's Galatians chapter 3. Because the law, a tutor, a disciplinarian, is null and void when Jesus came. Paul. So why in the world would Paul take, who is the one who says that the law no longer applies in almost every letter of his, make a group of people or a particular gender or women abide by the law when he is against the law? So that's the first question we have to do. We have to say, why in the world would Paul ever tell Christians to abide by the law? Secondly, there is no Jewish law that denies women to speak. In fact, you have women leaders in the Old Testament not only lead like Deborah and others, Queen Esther, but also speak. So there is no Jewish law that would pertain to this? And if there was, why in the world would Paul apply the law? Second key word is shameful. We have to remember that this was written in a culture in which honor and shame were played a part in public relationships. You were only as valuable and were as worthy in community as how much honor you garnered. If you did things that brought shame to a community, you were disregarded or denied. So what was happening here are two things. One, whatever this particular group of women were doing in the context of tongues and prophesying were bringing shame upon the community and therefore getting in the way of the church's witness. Paul states throughout his letters that bearing witness to Christ is the highest goal and priority of the church, and that if something gets in the way of bearing witness to Christ, then it should be denied or neglected. He does this very same argument not only in Romans and Galatians, but not Galatians, Romans and elsewhere, but also in Corinthians when he talks about eating meat. He says eating meat is lawful. But if it's getting in the way of bearing witness to the gospel, i.e., hindering the weak from becoming a part of the community, then don't eat meat, even though eating meat is acceptable. So there's something about the shame and honor that is disrupting the community as it pertains to women who are disrupting the church. You have to remember in Corinth, there is a temple in which there was priestesses who were in charge of the temple. They might, as they converted to Christ and found themselves at the table of Christ equal with men in leadership, they might have been abusing that power and therefore turning people away from Christ. And so Paul is addressing it. The last thing pertaining to the law is that if you look in Acts chapter 18, verse 13, the complaint that people were bringing against Paul and the Christian community was that they were disobeying the laws of Corinth. And if you read Acts 18:13, I have it written there, you'll note that the church is being persecuted and that the persecutors, the oppressors of the community, are claiming that they're making a legal argument that they're breaking the law in their worship habits and their theology and in their doctrine. They bring that legal argument before the city magistrates. You got to read it. I haven't read it in a while. And make an argument that they're breaking the law. And then I think if I remember correctly, the local magistrates shoo him away, and he says, well, it's just Jewish law. You guys handle it. It's an internal matter. According to the Jews, you all handle it. So for Paul to bring up this law shows me that in context of Acts 18:13, that there was something in the Corinthian culture that was disrupting worship or something in the Corinthian culture that was happening that was bringing shame upon the community. And that this is a contextual issue, meaning this is not for all the churches and the saints, but something in Corinth was going against the particular law that was bringing shame upon the community and disrupting the witness of Christ, as we can read in and gain that insight from Acts chapter 18, verse 13. So, well, this is getting really long, so I'm going to go. Please be at peace and dig deep in your word, people.